Have you ever considered how many things that you own that require a reliable supply of metals? Have you considered how much these demand is expected to increase the next coming year due to the shift to a greener economy and a lower carbon society? From solar panels, rechargeable batteries, electric cars, bikes, scooters, and phones, they all have something in common. They need cobalt, lead, lithium, manganese, and copper. Driving around in the city with your electric scooter may be pretty cool. It's fast and it's even low carbon impact, but at what cost? From children working in recycling lines and adults in underground mines, the range of health impacts associated with the production of your new phone or your electric bike is broad. Not only are there health risks for the workers in the factories who make your phone or for the miners who extract these minerals that power your bike, there are also direct and indirect impacts on the health and livelihoods for those living in the communities that surrounds the mines. This session will shed some light on the human costs of consumption. The event will focus on people working within the field of ICT, information and communication technology, with the aim to have an information sharing on health consequences along the supply chains and from the production and to the things we buy. It will provide an opportunity and presentation and discussion around what are the main health risks and impacts along the global supply chain of electronics and of other goods. What can be done to improve these conditions? Are there companies who act more responsibly than others? And what is the role of the trade unions, the international solidarity community, to improve these conditions? So I'm very happy to introduce our first presenter, which is Sanjida Shamsher, who is a researcher at Swedwatch. Warm welcome. You can have an applause in advance. Sanjida is a researcher, and she's a trainer also at Swedwatch. Her focus area is business impact on human rights related to gender, child rights, and labor rights. She's previously worked in Bangladesh on issues related to poverty reductions, women's rights, child labor, climate, and environment. So she has a master's degree and studied geography, community planning, and development studies. And she's here to present this very interesting report that we will penetrate further in the presentation and also discuss later in the panel. Warm welcome.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm very happy to see a lot of people in this early morning Saturday. It's a privilege. Thank you for having me here. And how should is it just the next? Oh, okay, it's here. So I will be talking about the health impacts and risks linked to mining and mineral used in ICT products, which is information and communication technologies. And I'll be referring it to as ICT, so you know that when I say ICT. So as Louise mentioned, that in these technological and information and communication, in these globalized areas and in this area where we all have access to information, and these products we use so much, like from a personal level to even it can be like our phone or our laptop, or we also use these services for water, energy, transport, even healthcare, food, farming, or space innovations. So it has a greater range for the ICT products. These products, as Louise mentioned, that as it will and is increasing, in 2019, it is expected the ICT market is expected to be worth of 4.4 trillion euros. So that's a huge amount of money, and you can maybe have a feeling that how big the market is. And these services, the ICT and the use of ICT is more and more encouraged and accepted because it's expected to also contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Goal Agenda by 2030. So let's see, what are the ICT products that we are using here? What do you have here? Phone. And it's mostly the phone or a tablet, my laptop, even the projectors, I guess, like all have ICT, all are the ICT products, right? So to make this product, we need a large quantities of different materials. And just take an example of like a smartphone. It needs 75 different types of elements, including many minerals which are extracted from the nature. And this extraction always associated with many impacts, positive as well as negative impacts. So the global, it's just to make a product from the raw material level, like extracting the mineral, to have a finished product, it needs, it's very complex. And it's non-transparent, and it is associated with conflicts, environmental degradation, as well as human rights impacts. Many of the ICT companies there are research and studies shows that many ICT companies have taken measures, taken actions to address the human rights and environmental impacts due to the public pressure and due to some legislations. But mostly there is an indication from these studies that mostly the companies are focusing on tin, titanium, tungsten, and gold, which you might know as 3TGs. But those are coming from mostly the conflict areas. Swedwatch, where I work, is an NGO, and we work a lot with research and investigation, and we monitor the companies and their impacts on human rights and environment. So we also, previously, our researcher has done studies in DR Congo, in Myanmar, to see that how these in general, how the mines or operation of mine impact on human rights and environment. So the companies, to many extent, we have also there are also indications that they are also addressing a little bit about an emergent accent about cobalt. However, we found that there are there are shortage or companies are not addressing that much in many other minerals, for example, copper, which is very important and vital mineral when it comes, because every ICT product needs this copper to increase its conductivity, like how the electricity passes through the material, through the product. So copper is very important, and there were indication or studies and research shows that companies are not addressing maybe as much as they are addressing 3TGs. Copper and other materials are not in their agenda, high in their agendas. So with that background, Swedwatch decided to look at the copper mining, and early this year, Swedwatch published this report. You can find it in our website, www.swedwatch.org. So this was a product, this was a publication report. It's a part of EU-funded project, Make ICT project. So our researcher looked at the cost of copper, which is where they looked at the human rights impact and environmental impact from the copper mining in Zambia. And Zambia is one of the largest copper producing and exporting countries. You can see that it's mentioned separately, not like others, and yet it's one of the poorest country in the world. So Swedwatch, as Swedwatch methodology, we always, when we do an investigation, we, we always contract a local partner. So in this case, we also contracted a local partner in Zambia who did our initial research work and interviewed the community members. And then in August, thank you, Luis. In August 2018, a team from Swedwatch who went to visit Zambia, it's called Shingola, the area. It's the northern part of Zambia, and the Shingola district hosts a large mine called Nachanga copper mine. Excuse me for my pronunciation, but that's why Swedwatch felt that this would be like Swedwatch visited 3 areas or 3 communities or villages in the Chingola area. So we have talked to a lot of people there, residents, and cross-verified with other relevant actors who are working in this area, in this sector as well. Many NGOs and media previously also reported about this Chingola area, and they reported the claims from the respondents of the Chingola mining areas that there are toxic, they have indicated that there are toxic spills and discharge of polluted and acidic wastewater which has contaminated their water sources in the area. And these water sources these are the water sources that provide drinking water for 40% of the people in Zambia. So it's very important that how the minings are operating and how they are treating their wastewater before discharging it to a natural water body. So the complaints in those reports, in the existing other research and studies, also showed that the communities complained about health-related problems, destruction of their farmlands, and food security issues, even in 2015. So when Swedwatch visited Shingola, many communities, we talked about to many community participants, the residents. So many members also mentioned that they have noticed that there was something wrong with the water already. And then they shared with Swedwatch. The residents also complained. Have you watched the video clip that was rolling when you were here? Some of you may have seen the video clips, right? It was running here. So there was one video clip which was showing that how the community has lost their land and they cannot grow any crops, and then the water pollution issues, that the water that they use for their daily life or daily day-to-day use, it's very toxicated and polluted. So the communities has shared their experience with Swedwatch team that they experience a lot of rashes from bathing and itching from wearing clothes that have been washed in those polluted water streams. When some of the residents, or many of the residents, talked about the loss of their croplands, so the people in those villages that Swedwatch team visited, they were mostly farmers or were depending on their own crops growing there. And they were almost well off, like they could eat properly 3 meals a day and have a steady income. But after the mine, the residents have mentioned that this was a problem because the water was so polluted that they felt that they are becoming sick. So they could feel that if you drink the water, you don't sleep because you need to keep running to the toilet. This is one man said to us. And stomach ache, diarrhea, this was very common complaint from the residents. Not only this one, but when our team talked to other people, they also mentioned these are as very common issues. And some of the residents also said that they are suspecting that previously many people, including children, died after drinking the water from these sources. So it could be the boreholes, the wells, or the water stream that's surrounding their villages. We also have talked with many women in the community, and they, due to the loss of land or fertility of the soil, lack of fertility or destroyed fertility of the soil, they could not grow more food. So it has an impact on the food security in that area. So these women were also saying that we could not provide 3 meals a day now for our family members. So it becomes a little bit like especially our children, they only can have 1 meal a day. And it feels they are, but it's the community members or the women, they were talking to us that, according to her, that they feel that their children are getting weak, malnutritious, even like the women. Another woman we talked with, she was at that time breastfeeding. So she also complained that she is always feeling dizzy. So she says that my breast milk dried up since I was not eating enough. So that felt like it's the emotion that these people wanted to share with us. And when we talked to this woman that she had 4 children, so she was saying that only 2 go to school. The girls ended up getting married after I failed to pay their school fees. What happened is like, when they have lost their income, and when they cannot send their kids to the school anymore. Like they didn't have money to send all 4 of the children to school, or many, it's only one woman's case, but many respondents also informed or shared with us that in this case, the young boys, it was very difficult for them to attract them towards the college, towards the school, continue their study, so they end up going to the mines, these irregulated working conditions, and there were an indication that they were also having increased consumption of alcohol among the youth. In general, the residents with whom the Swedwatch team talked, they said that in general, the problems that they could see, they indicated about skin diseases, teen pregnancy, increased consumption of alcohol, and coughing and respiratory problem among the children. So, findings from Swedwatch research and study in Xingola indicated that the company has not been able to protect the drinking water sources from the pollution or from the acidity or toxic elements. They could not, nor the companies could prevent groundwater and surface water to be used by the community while discharging their toxic wastewater. So the mining operation seems to have caused these negative impacts or adverse impact on the community, on the waters. And even the findings from the Chingola also indicate that the mining companies has failed to comply or to adhere with their own water management policy. So there is some indication that this company has actually caused these problems, and also this is based on the norms, international norms, regulations, and guidelines. They could not comply with the right to health, right to safe drinking water, for example. But these are, according to UN declaration, these are basic human rights. So this is what this report basically found in its investigation and research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjida, and please have a seat here in the panel. We will get some highlights on perspectives also, and the reason for this panel is also to cover some kind of solution to these challenges that you have presented from the report. Sofia Östmark is Secretary General for Union to Union, and she will comment and give some insight on the topic.
Thank you very much, Louise, and good morning to everyone. Sorry for being late. It was out of our control. It was the trains here in Sweden that sometimes are late, as you know. So that's something we have to work on here. But just to, I don't know really how the presentation started, but just to give you some highlights, as I think has been mentioned here, the increased demand that we have for solar panels, electric cars, electric bikes, and other things for a greener economy also has implications on the other side of the production chain in terms of minerals and metals that needs to be produced for these projects. It is about lithium, it's about cobalt, magnesium, copper, many different metals that needs to be produced. And how do we know that the production of these metals and minerals are done in a sustainable way, both for the environment but also socially for the people that we work with? We know that if we are going to reach the UN Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, and also the Paris Agreement, we need new sources of energy, but also use of electric cars and others. But at the same time, do we think about the whole production chain in this process? One issue that we have been working on at Union to Union and together with the trade union movement is the issue of a just transition. And what a just transition means is that we are going to try to work with a transition to a greener economy that both takes the environment but also the social issues into consideration. So it's about leaving really no one behind. We know that if we make a transition to a greener economy without thinking of the people that actually lose the jobs when we stop using black industries, what to happen with them? It leads to social tension and a lot of also other social problems. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, has calculated that the transition to a greener economy, it's estimated to create about 24 million new jobs, and at the same time about 6 million jobs will be lost. But what is problematic here is the match between the labor market. The new jobs might not be created at the same price as the one that has been lost, and how do we make sure that these green jobs are also good jobs and decent work for the people? So this is something that we and the trade unions has been working on for a long time and had now got a lot of tension or attraction. There is a writing about just transition in the Paris Agreement, and other actors beyond the trade union movement is getting to have more and more attention to a just transition. So this is an issue where I think we both here in Sweden but also globally needs to work on a little bit more. And as the Secretary General of Union to Union, we deal with these issues all the time. So for those of you that do not know what Union to Union is, it's the joint organization of all the Swedish trade unions. So it's LO, TCO, and SACO, and all their member trade unions that is part of this organization. So this means that if you in the audience is part of a trade union, you are also indirectly contributing to the work that we are doing. And we're quite unique in the sense that it's all the Swedish trade unions. We're on politically and gathering everything from architects to construction workers. So it's quite a fascinating organization. What we have seen in the mining and ICT sector, the information and communication and technology sector, is a huge increase in demand for metals and minerals. And the expected increase in the demand for cobalt for electric cars for the next 15 years is estimated to be an increase of 2,400%. So imagine that. It will be a lot of more cobalt that needs to be produced around the world. And if we look at copper, the growth is expected to be around 300%. So it's also quite a huge increase in the demand for these minerals and metals. And we see that even here in Sweden. I mean, now the focus is the decent working conditions in the mines all over the world. But here we are also seeing that they are exploring how can we have mines here that are producing lithium and other of these minerals and coppers. There was a show at Uppdrag Granskning, which is a Swedish TV show just this past week, looking at this issue. So I can really recommend that show for you to learn how this issue is also a Swedish issue for us here. At the same time, if we look around the world, we know that mining is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. Mining industry employs about 0.4% of the global labor market, but it actually the injuries or the fatal injuries, even the death in this sector is over 3% of the fatal injuries in the global labor market. Around 11,000 people die in the mining sector each year, and that is about 30 people per day. So 30 people per day or somewhere in the world actually die in the work in the mines. So it's an important issue not only for the working conditions in terms of salaries and other, but it's about security and environment for these people. We here in Sweden and around the world, we see in papers and in TV often about the disasters in mines, but still it doesn't really reflect the magnitude of the challenges that this sector actually encounters. Not only the fatal injuries, but also the diseases that this leads to among the workers that works in this very dangerous environmental. It's about dust, it's about gas and other toxins in the workplaces that you probably also heard from the Swedwatch report. So there is a lot of challenges that we need to deal with on several levels, I think. And in this work, the trade unions are an important factor. Trade unions, if well organized, good representation, they can work with the employer in these sectors, both at local level in the actual employment that they have, but also at a global level to fight to have better conditions and secure jobs. So more decent and more secure jobs. Here in Sweden, we take the right to organize a little bit for granted, maybe, and we sometimes forget what the role of trade unions have been for the development of Sweden. But if we looked at in the ICT section on the multinational companies that are the highest producers or the ones that are earning the most money, most of them are for countries that has not ratified the ILO Convention on the right to organize or the right to collective bargaining. So if we look, for example, at Amazon, Samsung, or Apple in the US, we know the trade union rate is not that high, and these companies also use the production in countries where they have neither either ratified the convention or really implemented them in practice. So here we have a long way to go and a lot of work that is needed. So I'm sure Glenn will tell you a bit more about the work that trade unions do in this area around the world. But just to mention a few areas where we at Union to Union work together with the global trade unions and the Swedish unions to try to improve these conditions. So currently we have projects in the ITC supply chain in Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Mongolia, India, Pakistan, Vietnam, Peru, DRC, Madagascar, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Ghana, and Uganda. So it's quite a widespread work that Union to Union does together with its partner in all this work. So through our support, unions are becoming better organized, so more people organizing in trade unions, but also the capacity of them to negotiate. We know the Swedish culture of cooperation on the labor markets is not kind of the way that it works in many other countries. So there I think this cooperative culture and having a social dialogue, a constructive social dialogue between the partners on the labor market, it is about giving and taking, is something that our project is focusing quite a lot about. A concrete example is Glencore, which is one of the largest multinational mining companies in the world, where Industry All has been working with them on a global level, and a regional project that Union to Union has together with the Swedish unions in this area has worked with collective bargaining or collective negotiations on the workplaces for Glencore. And that has actually led to improved working conditions for many people working in these mines, and also non-wage working conditions, so the right to toilets, the right to breaks, and the right to have lunch breaks, for example. So things that we all take for granted here is what the trade unions are working on for these areas. And the same in Madagascar, where we have support to a project where in many countries, there is also a lot of small competing unions, sometimes in the same workplace. So here we have been working to see how can we unite the many unions to have a stronger bargaining power against the employer or together with the employer. So that's a concrete examples where we have seen that we have united some of the trade unions in this work. One tool that the global unions and the unions are working with is also what is called global framework agreements, and you might have heard on that. That's something that's negotiated on a global level between a company and the global unions, and sometimes together also with the Swedish unions. For example, there is one with H&M, Industry All, and EF Metall, which is probably known also here. And that is about setting the standards for how this company should work in all of their supply chain around the world. And by doing these global framework agreements, the local companies and the local trade unions can then follow up, and making sure that the conditions are actually followed throughout the supply chain of that particular company. So that is a tool that the global unions work with, and then that we are working with to get implemented more on a local level. So I think I'll stop there and maybe come back, but just to emphasize that the role of the trade unions in this booming industry is really vital, and there I think we can do more together, and we will see probably more mines being developed, and making sure that when we go into a greener economy, it's not for the sake of workers. And I think trade unions are pushing for this the shift to a greener economy, but just making sure that the new green jobs are also decent works. So we look forward to working together with more partners in this, and I look forward also to hearing the other panelists and what they have to say about the issue.
Yes, well, thank you. Exactly. And Glenn Mpofana, you came all the way from Switzerland, where Industry All, which is a global union, is based. And you will tell us a little bit more hands-on on the practicalities and what you are working on. I was also very intrigued by your background, because you are a miner from the beginning and has the experience of working also yourself in the mines. And that's something that I think is very valuable in a panel like this, to actually hands-on know what you're talking about. So very warm welcome to you, and please feel free to elaborate.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And maybe just to illustrate the point, not so many years ago, actually, when I started in Geneva, I suffered from tuberculosis, TB. And it could be traced back to my days in the mines because of the latent period it takes for it to manifest. So this is one of the, examples, concrete examples. Industrial Global Union is not a federation. It is a union in the sense that it works for the same thing that our affiliates work, for in the mining industry. It comprises 50 million members across 140 countries and across 600 affiliates. And this makes it one of the most critical and important one-stop global production supply chain. Because in addition to mining, we organize around 14 other productive sectors, be it automotive, be it aerospace, be it chemicals, etc. So internally, this conversation, happens every day. We fight for global solidarity, we fight for social and economic justice, in addition to fighting to improve the conditions of mine workers around the world. And we do this through 5 key strategic objectives. You spoke about defending workers' rights, building trade union power and organizing, confronting global capital, fighting precarious work, and promoting sustainable industrial policy. And all this falls within the space of the transition that we are talking about, that everybody's, so it remains constant. Regardless of the transition, we remain with these challenges. And what needs to change, basically, to move, to this new economy. And one of the critical things is consumption. The never-ending need to consume, to satisfy, and I think it's a critical component of that. So, by defending workers' rights, by definition, we are concerned about human rights, because trade union rights are human rights, and they get violated almost every day in the industry by both mining companies and governments. And I've been asked to talk about these conditions and the role of trade unions. In fact, an anecdote. In my earlier life as a shop steward in the National Union of Mine Workers in South Africa, my general secretary once said that the most important thing that the union gave to mine workers was to restore their dignity. And that is very profound. And he also said that the most important thing to come out of a mine is a mine worker. So basically, mine workers are responsible for the conditions and the modern life that society takes for granted. You mentioned figures around the ILO, and I'll just mention some in terms of illustrating the importance of mining in the global economy. The ILO estimates that mining is undertaken in over 100 countries, and the World Bank regards more than 50 other countries as mining countries because of the importance of mining exports to their economies. And this basically sheds a new light on the role of mine workers. It is estimated that globally, the formal mining sector employs more than 3.7 million workers, and that 1.5 million of these are in developed countries, while 2.2 are in developing countries. And with regard to industrial itself, we have about 70 national mining affiliates, which makes a significant component of Industrial Global Union. Now, considering the importance of mining to the global economy in terms of the contribution it makes to the global GDP of the economy and the national economies of mining countries, the conditions of mine workers stand in stark contrast to that contribution. Estimates of the contribution of mining and its supply chain is estimated to be around 40 to 50% of the global GDP, But as I said, that contribution is not reflected in the everyday life working conditions of the mine workers and the life chances of their families. The mining sector narrative is about wealth and poverty living by side. If you've heard of Marikana, Marikana basically epitomizes the mining sector, where the wealth that is being created is basically exported as it is, leaving behind abject poverty. And these are the questions that we have to, the working conditions are terrible. We heard about health and safety. In fact, we are confronted with very desperate situations of mine workers setting themselves on fire to bring attention to their plight. And this happened in Ukraine and in Mongolia, you know, simply because they are not paid the salaries that they have worked for, you know, and it's a tragedy that as we consume these products that the mining produces, we forget to link them to the conditions, you know, that produces these minerals. And this is the linkage that we must make across the supply chain. And this is the hidden cost of consumption that is not reflected in the price consumer pays for the everyday products that they use, you know. Occupational lung disease, pneumoconiosis, I spoke about TB at a personal level, silicosis. And what happens is that these mining companies externalize that cost to governments and society. They are not responsible for the damages that they inflict on mine workers. They are not responsible for the damages that they inflict on the environment. You know, most of the money that comes out of mining is repatriated back to the countries from which these mining companies come from. So essentially, one could argue that mining is a zero-sum game, you know, at the end of the day. And this is what we want to bring out, the reality of, you know. So what we are doing in respect of health and safety is that we have a global campaign, continuous, live, you know, on health and safety. It's continuous, and it calls for ratification of ILO Convention 176. And we've been successful in countries like Russia, Turkey, Mongolia, and Mozambique. And in conclusion, given time, is that improving conditions in the mining sector will need to tie those conditions to the global supply chain, to begin to ask questions around, you know, customers and suppliers. Under what conditions has these products been produced? And what can everybody do along the supply chains to help it improve in the conditions of the mining sector or the mine workers broadly? So that would be my 2 cents worth, you know, of contribution to the debate.
Yes, and I think the panel discussion that we are now moving on with is exactly about that, like the solution orientation in regards to different levels of responsibility and challenges, like from an individual perspective, a consumer power perspective, and also to the next level, like policy and framework. Yes. What can we do to advocate the rights, and how can we have a human rights perspective within both national and international and global level on policy framework? And also, what are the possibilities to solidarize around these issues, and what are the possibilities also to, we have seminars like this to educate and to mobilize, but are there other ways for individuals to engage within this? I got the message that we can push the ending time a little bit, so for those of you who have other things on your agenda, of course, you're free to leave at 11, but maybe we'll talk a little bit about, after 11 as well in this panel, since we were a little bit delayed, just so you know, for practicalities. I also forgot to introduce myself in the beginning because I was so stressed that I might be the only one here. So I'll take the opportunity just to do that. My name is Louise Lindfors. I'm Secretary General for Afrikagrupperna, which is also one of the NGOs that are members of Swedwatch. So we have also worked on a previous report on platinum a couple of years ago. Yeah. So we are also much involved and interested in these kind of questions, of course. But I think we'll have like a round, and the one most eager can grab the question first. If we start on like policy level, what interesting things are going on right now, perhaps in Sweden, also in EU level, UN level, or perhaps in other specific bilateral dialogues, etc., that you could highlight on and give some hope on how to push for these, the human rights perspective in this issue? Glenn, you feel eager. Yes, please, have a go.
One of the campaigns that are run by civil society and trade unions within the UN system is the campaign for a UN binding treaty.
Yeah.
And on global, basically, and we think it is being driven by developing countries. And it's, most developed countries, the EU, etc., are pushing back. And you wonder why governments should push back on something that should develop, that should be of interest, because it is completely directed at multinational companies. And basically, it points to the close relationship between capital and governments.
Exactly. Yeah.
And to the point that if we are not careful enough, our governments by default basically creates policies not for the citizens, but for multinational companies. And it points to the absence of a global jurisdiction for multinational conduct, And in the absence of that, what else is there?
Exactly.
What else is there? There is an emergence of what we call standard initiatives, which unfortunately are voluntary. But given that we participate along the supply chain in a lot of these, in the different sectors. But if you take the importance of the mining sector as the upstream, where change must happen, influencing it down the supply chain, downstream. We have one that is called the Initiative for Responsible Mining and Assurance, which basically takes a value chain perspective, starting with the mining sector, to say what constitutes responsible business practice, and these are some of the, and EMA has got civil society chambers there, NGOs, indigenous communities, mining companies. So this is a very powerful tool that we think can be an instrument for everybody to rally around.
Yeah. Could you perhaps also comment on, because Afrikagrupperna does also much work on the binding treaty and try to push for that, and we find it also that there is a challenge within, like, pushing from an NGO perspective and civil society level. That's a very strong position and possible to do, but then it becomes complicated when it comes into the private sector and the companies' roles in this. Because on the one hand, you want to include everyone and have a broader analysis, and on the other hand, you might feel also that you become instrumental in some kind of greenwashing challenges or risks. Do you have from industry all any comments on that, or?
In fact, before we even get in, we do an analysis, in terms of how can we shape whatever initiative in the direction that we want it, so that it does not become what you say, greenwash, So what I think in the mining space with all this, we're trying to redefine what is called the social license to operate, and which is how does it look like? How does a just social license to operate looks like? And it takes all the elements, that you've mentioned, to the extent that it pushes governments, and this is where the intersection between the level of this campaign for a binding treaty and other initiatives, coincide. Because as we expect governments to do things, what can the sector, private sector, do itself, and it is only when it commits to some of these principles that...
Exactly, so that's the balance that's between committing and or supporting. It's tricky. Sophia, you had had a comment.
Yeah, no, I think it's very important with responsible business supply chains, and that's an issue that has been discussed increasingly, I think, in different forums, which is also a consequence of consumers that are pushing companies to actually do a better business or more fair business. So I think that is a very important area. But at the same time, you also need the different stakeholders. You also need the government to take their responsibilities in the different countries where you have the mines.
Yeah.
So there is also pushing the governments and the dialogue, I think, between governments, businesses, and trade unions in these issues. I mean, that's the whole thing about having a just transition, is about having a constructive dialogue about the different parties that are engaged in this issue. So having a well-functioning social dialogue is a policy issue that I think is also increasingly getting attention, but needs more as well, because business cannot do it alone. It also needs the governments. I mentioned that in many countries they have not ratified the Convention of the Right to Organize or the Right to Collective Bargaining. In some countries they have ratified it, but practically it's not really working, and there is a lot of challenges for trade unions among the world. Every year the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, makes a study on the conditions for trade unions around the world. And there we see an increasing number of trade unionists being killed around the world. We see also the right to organize is increasingly under threat. So we don't see a positive development on the policy side there either. The just transition concept, I think, is important to push, not only for the trade unions, but also together with governments and businesses and investors. And currently there is a network of governments committed to a just transition. There is also a network of investors. We should not forget the investor powers, because it's the investors that finance the companies as well. So if the investors push pressure on the companies, that can also have very positive consequences. One thing that we haven't touched about is about the certification, because how do we know actually how these metals and minerals are being produced? There was a study earlier this year about the scooters, the electric scooters in the streets of Stockholm and maybe other cities in Sweden as well. And they asked the owners of these companies, do you know how the lithium to your electric batteries of these scooters are being produced? And I think it was one of them that actually knew the whole supply chain of that mineral. So it's about the knowledge throughout the supply chain about these issues. And here I think it would be interesting to hear a little bit more from Glenn about the thoughts about possible certification that can also make it easier both for companies, but also for us as consumers to actually choose the right thing. Because I think here we can say that we should not consume, and I think that's important that we should not consume, but at the same time around the world we know that when people get more economic possibilities, they start to consume. And when we want to be, make contribution to a greener economy by buying an electric car or using an electric bike, we don't think that it might have negative consequences. So I think we cannot, it's difficult to make the right choices all the time. So then I think working on the working conditions in the supply chain together with trade unions, employers and governments is crucial, because it will not stop probably. It will continue to increase.
Yes, but then the social dialogue and then the cooperation between different levels are key, of course, on policy level. Would you, Sanjida, like to comment anything from a Swedwatch perspective?
Yeah, I think that I would take a little bit different angle from of this question of this policy, how you would push for that. I agree with the consumer's power of asking questions and wanting to know more about the supply chain, but as I mentioned in my presentation as well, it's so non-transparent and so complex, the whole issue of supply chain, and not only for any ICT-related product. And as you mentioned very rightfully that very few companies, there are indications from research that very few companies know about the exact where the products are or the minerals have been extracted. But from the voluntary initiatives that Glenn you mentioned, that yes, there are rules and regulations and norms. Many of them are voluntary. For example, the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, and it's very clearly states the roles and responsibilities of state and companies, private companies, because private companies, as the previous UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, that they are so influential actors that we have to bring them on board to ensure that the global goals are achieved by 2030. So they are really an influential actors. But for UNGPs, the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights also say that it's the government duty to protect the human rights of the citizens, but it's the responsibility of the businesses, which is the first pillar is to protect, which is government's duty. The second pillar talks about the responsibility, which is the private actors, businesses, investors, their responsibility to respect the human rights of the citizens where they are operating. It doesn't matter that how big their sector is, how far their supply chain is, but as long as they are somehow linked with the business, either they are causing or contributing or has any linkage to any of the impact from their supply chain operation, they have to take the responsibility. Of course, the level are mentioned very clearly in the guiding principles, and I am not going too deep into that, but I just want to say that these are even for the weaker states where there are weak rule of law, because businesses move all those countries so that they can take some advantage of low labor costs, weak rule of law. So for such countries, when the business operates in such countries, they have to take more responsibilities, and they cannot just say, oh, their country has no law, so what can we do? And the business cannot say that. They have to take into account that what are the international norms saying, what are the international other stronger regulations or laws saying about the particular impact, and then they have to take responsibility, either mitigate or prevent or contribute to any kind of minimizing the impact. So this is what the UN Guiding Principles said, and many of the other norms and regulations, even some countries have also adopted the United Nations Guiding Principles into their policies. So of course they are also trying to push for a binding treaty for UNGPs. It's still voluntary, but I think this is the only one still now that every country and every initiative has adopted, has agreed to use the United Nations Guiding Principles. And there are also Dodd-Frank Act, US legislation to deal with the mineral and mining sector. There are OECD guidelines on responsible sourcing of minerals, and of course there are many elements taken from or adapted from United Nations Guiding Principles. And at EU level also there are responsible mineral and initiatives. So there are initiatives that companies can take, and companies are not only encouraged, many companies are also from many countries, they push for by law that they have to take those responsibilities and mitigate the impacts.
So to monitor and demand compliance of international labor standards and also global supply chains can play a substantial role in ensuring the decent working conditions and access to health and safety. From an individual citizen perspective then, like a message to the audience, what can we take further in our own actions, and how can we push? I often say that you should join a civil society organization and speak out on injustice, etc. That's one thing you can mobilize and engage, like from an individual level. But you mentioned also certifications, etc. Could you perhaps we start with you and we'll go this way.
Yeah. Swedwatch has not done specifically any investigation on the certifications, but doing all other kind of research, like when we looked at the copper with the cost, or when we also looked at the platinum or other metals in Congo, diamonds, it's still there are questions on how certifications are dealing with the labor condition, with the environmental impacts. But from Swedwatch perspective, it would be difficult to take a side and say that, oh, this is bad or good. But of course, there are questions. And if we still get all those impacts when we go and visit the countries, if we get all those impacts still exist, then of course we have to question the certification as well.
So it's work in progress, but you can also think that you have a consumer power, at least when you
yeah,
go
there
to a
are
shop and
there are consumers. Yeah, just use your power of question. That is I think that works a lot, and let the companies know that you are more aware now, and you want to know more from them, from the companies. So start from the salesperson and use that. Okay, if you don't know, ask your company. I want the answer. Where is your mineral coming from? And even like how many of you knew that a smartphone can contain 75 different elements? No, some. I can see some. So you already know that it has a lot of. So just ask, how many do the companies know that? How many elements do you think you can trace? So there are a lot of power in consumers' questions.
Glenn, what is your key message and recommendations?
I think questioning consumer consciousness, cobalt comes from the DRC. And I'm sure you are familiar with the DRC, a failed state, essentially.
Conflict area.
And the power of the mining company called Glencore, which basically controls the market for cobalt. What can we do is, as citizens, for instance, sensitivity, reputational damage across the supply chain, BMW taking a decision that they are getting out of the DRC from sourcing cobalt from the DRC because of the associational reputational.
Okay.
So it's a very, and so basically, I think the consumer and the market have the power to change. And I think the question is, how can you as a consumer play that role in your buying or purchasing decisions? Ultimately, it comes down to that, you know.
And Sophia?
You know, a lot have already been said, and I said it's not always easy to be a consumer either, because you don't have all the knowledge to take the right decisions. So there I think it's about knowledge, and that's not the consumer only themselves, but also the society and us as organization to actually talk about these issues. And of course, one key message is to organize yourself in a trade union and make sure that they have a strong international engagement, that working with the partners, and also these global framework agreements that can be a way of pushing, you know, global dialogue together with local action. So these are some of the issues that I would say. But knowledge is always good. And watch this Uppdrag Granskning show. You can learn a little bit about the market here in Sweden as well.
And all the reports that you can also find at Swedwatch, etc. Yeah, knowledge is power. Thank you so much for spreading your knowledge at this seminar, and thank you for attending the seminar, all the lovely audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.